Hi, I don't normally do introductions to my videos, but I think on this occasion it's warranted for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I need to provide a little bit of context for anyone that is not already familiar with Jordan Hall and Daniel Schmachtenberger and the rest of the Neurohacker Collective's work and others along similar lines. Um, so I need to provide just a little bit of context. If you have not already, I highly recommend you watch these two videos, The Paradox of the Times and the three-way conversation between Jordan Hall, Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jamie Wheel. That'll give you a pretty good background to the ideas that we're going to discuss here. This really does follow on from that, but if you're not going to take the 4 hours or whatever to fill yourself in with that, I do need to provide just a little bit of context as to what this conversation is about. And so Jordan and his colleagues, they make the case that the only way to actually tackle and handle the challenges and problems that are facing and coming our way is through the creation of effective, decentralized collective intelligence, large numbers of people collaborating in non-rivalrous ways in order to interface with and find solutions to the highly complex problems that face us. Key to that process is the ability to discern in communications between people the wheat from the chaff, the signal from the noise, as they would put it. And so the ability to home in directly and immediately on what is of value and kind of ignore what is not is crucial to the whole process of the decentralized collective intelligence. And it is that idea of discernment, how to build discernment, what discernment is and how to go about building it, that we're going to be exploring in more detail in this video. The other thing I would like to say is that I had a technical breakdown about 10 minutes in, something like that. I had a technical breakdown, and it took about 10 minutes or so for me to get myself organized and get back on another computer. And so not only is there a severe drop off in video quality at my end, Jordan's fine, but at my end there's a severe drop off in video quality. But also I would just like to say publicly that, you know, Jordan just hung around and waited for me, a guy he doesn't know with a channel with, you know, very few subscribers and very little exposure. And so I think it speaks to his authenticity and willingness to, you know, just talk to people that he thinks, you know, the right time has to come to talk about a certain thing, which I'm pretty sure why he's agreed to talk to me. So, yeah, I think that's all I really want to say, and I'll run the interview from now. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoy it. It's a great pleasure.
Good to see you.
I'm not entirely sure why you've agreed to talk to me, but I'm very, very grateful that you have.
The question itself is actually always it's a mystery for me. So I have found myself over the past, gosh, I guess actually 5 years. That's the right way of putting this. So
what you do when you feel it and you don't when you don't, kind of thing. Is that basically the deal?
Yeah, and in many ways, I actually also am noticing when things show up. So I quite significantly intend not to have a strategy, particularly not something that you call a marketing strategy, right? So I don't, if I feel, even if I feel myself noticing that there's a certain, what do you may put it, almost like a sociopathic or non-human potential of like, I could benefit from this conversation.
Yeah. You'll avoid it on that basis. Like if that's the vibe you're feeling, you'll avoid it, or you'll treat it with care at least.
I'll treat it with care is actually a better way of putting it. Yeah. And then, and I'm not familiar with any circumstance in this milieu, like a conversation that is being recorded that may eventually at some point be shared. Have I proactively reached out to anyone?
Right. There are a couple of areas that I'd particularly like to hear more from you about. And I think if I lay all of this out at the start, rather than ask you a question, get an answer, ask you another question, get another answer, I lay out sort of all of the areas that I'm interested in and exploring with you at the start. And then within the conversation that we have, you can, when it feels like a good time to touch on one of those things, you can then choose to touch on it then. Do you see what I mean? Right. And so
sounds fine. Yeah.
The first one, as I mentioned in the email to you, is discernment. I mean, as I've heard you say, this is foundational to the whole thing, right? Is the ability to discern well. And so I would like to explore more what tools we have available to us as individuals for discernment. How reliable are those tools? What are the most effective ways of honing those tools, and what are good indicators that we are doing discernment well. What kinds of things make good indicators that we are doing discernment well? Also, traps. I mean, I've just listened to another thing on Rebel Wisdom. Rosalind, what was her name? I can't remember. No, sorry, Bonita Roy. And it was really, you're nodding, you've obviously seen it. And she was talking about this, that, you know, we are tackling problems, game A problems in your frame. We're tackling game A problems, and all we have at our disposal at the moment is game A code. And we may run it in a way that feels different and like we're doing something different, but actually it's the only tool at our disposal. And so one of the biggest traps I see with discernment is using game A structures, game A architecture to discern. And it'll be so easy to fool ourselves because we've come across a cool new idea, right? That we're not actually just, I'm not sure I'm putting this all that clearly, but we're not just actually running the same routines that we were always running, but maybe
I feel like I understand what you're saying.
Different, yeah. And confirmation of bias, I think, is going to feel pretty good. That might feel like the signal that you're trying to home in on when it's not actually, it's masquerading as signal. So these kinds of traps, I'd like to explore what you think about what you think about these traps and ways of possibly avoiding them.
I imagine, to be perfectly frank, that will be all the time we'll have. That's a big
no, that's absolutely fine. I want to do it properly as well. So, and let's not clutter up your head with too much other crap as well, right? Because
that's exactly what I was feeling.
Yeah. No worries. Yeah, absolutely.
I was spooling out space to try to hold the whole thing, and then I was like, wow, okay, this is already quite expansive. And I think we can actually get a lot of interesting stuff done. I like a whole lot about both the timing. I think now is a time where this particular point is very important, and maybe is like in the sweet spot. People are contemplating it in a place where they could actually something useful could happen. Okay, so discernment. Maybe the first thing for me to put out there is I think the way to look at what I'm about to say is to recognize that I myself am somewhere in, say, 33 to 50% in discernment. Right? So I'm very much in the process of building capacity and even building sensitivity to the essence of what it is. So in some sense, there's a negative to that because I'm speaking without a great deal of embodied wisdom and experience. So, but on the other side, my edges are edgy, right? So it's possible to
and they're new and they're fresh, and absolutely.
Yeah,
you're thinking about this stuff all the time, right? Far more than
I am thinking about this stuff all the time. Yeah, I'm definitely spending a lot of time contemplating it and looking at quite diverse ways of looking at it. And I think that's one of the things that I tend to do is not go down one path, but actually try multiple distinct and often paths that don't communicate with each other or aren't even aware of each other, and try to see what that higher perspective gives. So in this case, what I think might be a really good way of doing it is actually trying to frame it in a very, what's the right way of putting it, very naturalistic way. So I want to talk about discernment, or to me, maybe it's the simplest and clearest way is to talk about it in a fashion that is leaning more in the direction of, say, cognitive neuroscience.
Okay.
So very naturalistic nature. And here, I mean, Vervaeke's stuff is like a really good bone broth. It's just rich. Yeah. And I don't know if you know this stuff, but he has a nice stack where he stacks different ways of knowing. He has participatory knowing, and then he has perspectival knowing. He has two more, a propositional knowing at the top, but if we just focus on participatory and perspectival, which also map to things like relevance realization and salience landscaping, what I'd like to do is try to actually ground discernment in things that are very simple, because oftentimes in this world, we can have, frankly, pretty esoteric words. And I think this discernment isn't actually that esoteric. I mean, at a certain point, we can get there, but let's start grounded. So we can begin with just the notion of the body and perception. And we might say that discernment is the increasingly skillful capacity to perceive what is really happening, to perceive simply what really is, with both precision and subtlety. And okay, so when we talk about that, we're talking about perception. And in the context of perception, we can begin to tease apart what are the different aspects of perception, both in terms of what supports it and what gets in the way.
Yeah.
In terms of what supports it, again, we can be very simple. We could talk about, for example, discernment in terms of just being able to see with our eyes. And if you have a child, an infant, in the beginning, as an infant is born, their capacity to perceive with their eyes is, in fact, quite low. They can only focus a couple of inches. In fact, they can't control the movement of their eyes. So discernment with eyes, low. As you mature, your capacity to focus properly, your ability to actually identify colors and be able to actually literally at a neurological level map the way the rods and the cones are being stimulated by different wavelengths of light to particular qualia is the process of discernment. Right? So you can actually perceive that there is a face in front of you and that it's mom, and you can actually have that level of precision and nuance.
Your ability to make sense of the world through your visual senses is taught to you, if you like, by you sort of acquire membership in the collectively agreed ways of perceiving the world, right? And so the development of your visual sense is as much a cultural phenomenon as a biological phenomenon, right? Or at least there's sort of elements as much. I wouldn't say
I was going to say it's elements. I wouldn't say it's as much. I would say that in the context of other things that have a much larger, like the name of the color that you see is quite distinctly cultural. The fact that you are distinguishing colors is much more biological. And so this is like something happening. And this, I think, is the key, is discernment has this connection through the entire arc of evolution. Right? So if you want to run it back from your eyes, go back to like the beginning of the ability of biological organism to have photonic sensitivity at all. Right? The ability to distinguish from light and dark in some physical way that is reliable. And then the degree to which that capacity, because it has some fitness advantage, presumably, becomes upregulated. And there's an increasing ability, which eventually becomes the specialization of particular cells that are photosensitive. And then the differentiation of those particular cells to be more particularly photosensitive until eventually get the development of things like eyes and the visual cortex, right? So, and there's a continuity there. There's actually in me, in my visual field, there's actually a connection all the way back down to that very beginning moment of the utility, and perhaps in this case, the stochastic or random notion of distinguishing these two characteristics, which actually predates visual field, of course, because obviously under the hot sun, simply being in the presence of photons is kinetic. It can actually kill me just by, regardless of whether or not I can distinguish its presence. And that, I think, is kind of a good way of grasping, is to remember that discernment is very grounded. It goes all the way down, as far down as you care to examine it, in the becomingness of physical reality. And a big part of this is, again, this idea of participatory knowing is, at the bottom, discernment is really about the degree to which you are part of the context. You're not separate from it. You are of it.
Yeah.
There's a continuity between you and world that is deeply, deeply connected in many, many different and interconnected and subtle ways. So then I have, let's go one level higher. So let's say I with my visual field, I perceive some object in the world in front of me. But of course, it may be a hallucination. It may be a visual hallucination. Right? So, okay, neat. So I have this notion. I've just added a whole concept, which is the possibility not just of, call it richness, precision, and nuance in my visual field, for my ability to distinguish between red and blue, and also my ability to now distinguish between red and orange, and then red and rose, right? That level of nuance and precision. But now I have the concept of actual error, where I think I see the color red, but I don't. I actually have some other artifact. Something else is producing that. So, but of course, now what I have is I have a multimodal possibility. I can reach out with my hand towards that thing that my eyes see and using a completely different mode of perception. And now it's touch or smell or hearing.
Yeah.
Attempt to verify.
Closer, whatever. Yeah.
Whatever, right? Now, and if I do, if my hand goes right through it, what happens is that I actually have my capacity to perceive what is really happening goes way up. Like, oh, I'm actually not seeing a real red object. Instead, there's something else that I'll categorize as a hallucination, or my daughter's 10 months and we have a prism. So she'll see a red light on the wall.
doesn't
And
fit in your doesn't fit in your paradigm, right? Whatever it is, doesn't
whatever it is,
yeah,
it doesn't fit in your paradigm.
yeah,
Exactly. So now I'm at least in a novel space, and I have there's something about what I thought I saw isn't there. And let's hold that piece, because this recursion between what you are perceiving in its most raw sense and what you perceive that you perceive in its sense-making sense, I think is exactly at the point where discernment sits. It's right between those two. So we have this continual movement of a training, a development of capacity in modes of perception, in an ability to achieve reliability and precision and subtlety. And then in expanding these modes of perception, each one of which brings its own characteristic capacities to perceive, and the complex of which increases the overall capacity for discernment. And here's where I would point out that if we go back to the notion of the body, there's a very large number of these modes of perception, right? There's not six senses, there's many thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. It's really hard to know. Some are very, very interior. There really are nuanced ways of actually discerning, say, for example, the way that your stomach is responding to the experience that you're having. And you can feel that if you notice it, you can feel it. Your chest contracts like muscles. You can actually feel the sensation of the change of your breathing. And there's something going on there. There's some signal that is contained in this subtle nuance. Because again, this goes all the way down the evolutionary arc, right? Billions of years of life endeavoring to more fully and accurately and precisely and subtly perceive what is real, so as to be able to make better choices in the context of being better
So
responses.
discernment is the whole shebang, though, right? It's every single one of those thousands of very, very subtle messages going on in your body all at the same time, right? And
all at the same time, right?
yeah. And so, I mean, it is impossible, obviously, to be aware of each and every one of those on an individual basis in any given moment, right? And so that's the symphony. You're listening to the symphony. You can't necessarily pick out the instruments, but you're aware of the symphony. Is that a reasonable analogy? Is that?
Yeah. So now we have another concept that we can put, and the concept here is called feelings. And here I want to disambiguate emotions from feelings.
From feelings, yeah.
And I want to re-support feelings for being something that is one of the more powerful instruments in discernment. So the feeling I'd like to point to is the feeling of balance. So you're standing. Do you feel balanced or not? You're standing on one foot. And notice that you can actually tell that there's a real concept, that real notion of, oh yes, there's a feeling, a sensation of balance that I can notice. And by the way, it's extremely effective. Like if I'm standing on one foot and I'm on a platform, for example, as if it starts to move the platform, I don't know that that's happening. I feel the lack of balance. Now, think about that in the context of what you just said. What's actually happening is I'm getting probably several thousand distinct feedbacks from my muscular system and from different aspects of my proprioceptive systems that are actually, I can't be aware of, frankly, any one or two of them, but the synthetic integration of all of them together in a singular quality that I can be aware of, known as the feeling of balance, is that thing.
And so that's the coherent entity, right? Is the feeling of balance. Yeah,
you got it. So a feeling is a coherent entity in relationship to a potentially extraordinarily vast number of distinct perceptions that are synthetically integrated into something that provides a qualitative sense of. Right? And it's a very
and that's the participatory knowing, right? I mean, you know that for sure in yourself how you feel. There's no
right.
Yeah.
Right. And so the capacity to develop or refining and developing discernment is very much that capacity to be more and more aware of and sensitive to the complex of feelings that are arising, and then being able to actually use them moment to moment in making the choices that you make. And again, we can make this very simple. If you're doing gymnastics or martial arts or very embodied actions, skateboarding, you'll notice that, like the process of learning how to ollie and then the process of learning how to go from ollie to a kickflip is it's a feeling, and it's a way of actually using and linking together a series of feelings, each one of which is basically just saying yes or rightness, and with extremely fine-tuned, subtle shifts in very specific context, right? If you've ever seen somebody do a kickflip, it's a little bit mind-blowing that it's possible at all. And yet, after a bit of practice, the body can do that. And the same thing is true across the entire spectrum of human activities. Okay, so now anchoring it very deeply in that evolutionary story and in the groundedness and in the body, now let's move to the place that ends up being a lot of trouble. And a lot of trouble is the things that get in between us and discernment.
Yeah.
And this is largely places where we have projections,
Mm-hmm.
and or we have knowing or schema of
Rigorous
understanding.
intentions as well, right?
That's very good. Let's see what we say. How would we say that very cleanly? Yes, that would actually be something like, I would say, in my sense, something like lack of integrity or lack of
Mm-hmm.
congruence,
Yeah.
where in your own self, there may actually be multiple distinct processes that are running. And I guess that's actually the whole category, where uh, if you don't, if you're not sensitive to the degree to which you are an agent in your own perception,
Yeah.
then that agency can very much muddy the waters, can very much get in the way. You might say something to me, and that I might respond in a certain way, perhaps even a certain tone comes out of my voice. And that's because some part of me heard, felt, thought it heard, it was coming from a different place that put an energy or a quality of, say, defensiveness or a
Mm-hmm.
quality of protectiveness, and just kind of injected it into the complex of expression, because expression is as subtle, complex, and nuanced as perception, right? Both
Absolutely.
directions.
And even
And
if there was no such tone coming from your end, that doesn't stop me perceiving such a tone, even where none was intended, right?
exactly. And so they're all true. And of course, here's that whole thing of like microaggressions, because there's certainly a thing as micro expressions. And the reality is that my body is processing a very large number of things all at the same time, right? Even as I'm in present to speaking with you, there are things going on in the back of my mind that are recalling, my conversation with my wife, considering my daughter, the things that's going on in the future. The more capable I am of being present here, the less I'm bringing into this interaction that creates noise. Right? The more what's happening is real. And this is crucial. Like the idea of being present, I
Yeah.
think is very much that. And the more I'm elsewhere, the more I'm bringing in things that are actually going to generate noise in our relationship, in our conversation. The more I'm present, the more what I am generating, what I'm expressing, and what I'm perceiving is part of what's happening here in this moment. And so to kind of tag that, presence and discernment are very closely linked. The
Right.
more
Yeah.
present you are, the less you're creating or perceiving noise in what is really happening.
I mean, attention is also a function of presence, right? I know you can't be attentive without being present, right? There's part of the same thing, giving your attention, giving your concentration, giving your full listening capacity to, these are all components of presence, right?
Yeah, I mean, to be very precise, you can't pay attention to what is happening here without being present. Your attention is going to be, by definition, elsewhere, and that's, I think, was what you were saying. Yeah, and so we've got a lot of interesting stuff, right? There's the degree to which I'm not present, which then means my attention is elsewhere. There's the degree to which, by the fact that I'm not present, I am simultaneously mixing where my attention is elsewhere with what I'm perceiving here, which can be very confusing, and quite likely bringing in the influences of that elsewhere into what I'm presenting here, which can be quite confusing. So let's get that out of the way. Let's say I'm actually doing a pretty good job of being present. And let's say, for example, I'm actually doing a pretty good job of being aware, sensitive to what's going on. Notice that, at least in my experience, this requires a bit of slowing down. The more you speed up, the less likely you'll have the ability to kind of allow the pace of processing in your body to show up in your experience.
And yet our tendency is to do the exact opposite, right? When we feel nervous, when we feel under pressure, when we feel uncertain, we tend to rush through it because it's uncomfortable, right? Our tendency is to do the exact opposite of that, I think.
Yes. And that notion of avoidance seems like it's pretty fundamental to getting in the way of discernment. And so, in my experience in particular, learning how to convert avoidance into curiosity is a pretty powerful alchemical move.
Okay, would you be able to point to a type of practice that might engender that sort of change? Because I think I agree with you. I think that's important. Yeah, turning uncertainty into curiosity. I think that's a really important one. I like that.
Yeah. Well, one is the degree to which you can actually do things by intent. So one is being conscious of the intent, and then oftentimes actually setting the intent. So speaking it out loud actually helps, or writing it down. Setting the intent explicitly. Now, of course, you can have simple practices. So simplifying is a good way to hone these kinds of very specific things. So meditation practice, for example.
Yeah. It's always a good one, right, for almost anything, pretty much. It's a good start.
Things that don't involve body movement. If you're trying to do dancing, meditation may get in the way a little bit. But meditating first and then doing dancing can be quite helpful.
Yeah.
So in this case, you can then say, let's identify something that I'm pretty sure I have an avoidance behavior around. Some rough part of my emotional development. Some relationship that's tough. Some piece of myself that I know that I feel shame about.
Mm-hmm.
And then in your meditation practice, and intentionally point your attention towards that. And then in the context of your meditation practice, you now have the capacity to move very slowly and notice where in your body, for example, the avoidance shows up. And you can notice when that avoidance in your body happens, what happens in your mind. You just slow down the film until you're actually able to see with real precision what these things are. And, my experience, at least as a human, is that I've got a lot of these, lots and lots and lots of things that are characteristic of avoidance behavior. And so it's not hard for me to practice just on my own interior. And then what I noticed also then is, as I've built some time in that, and it doesn't take actually that long, like in the order of, say, 3 to 6 months, some habits can begin to be built where the attentional structure, the relevance realization machinery is beginning to be trained. It can't help but, when the body responds in a certain way, to go, oh, well, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Seen that before. What's that? All right. So then as you're in life, as you're experiencing things, somebody does or says something, and now that habit of being attentive begins to actually come up, as opposed to just become unconscious, and unconscious avoidance behavior kicks in.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? It is usually unconscious. You just do it. You don't even realize that you've done it, and so you continue to avoid the same things. Yeah, no, I like that a lot. And so as you start to bring it into awareness, you start to create, I don't know, like a more generally used pathway that can then start to bring other ones that you hadn't been aware of before. You now start to become aware of them because the light gets brighter. You can shine it on more things, right? Yeah.
Got it. Just think about the eyeball. Exactly. Think about the eyeball. And then what you'd like to do is you actually like to get some wins. You'd like to get the body to have that signal of, that was actually a good use of time. So to the degree to which you can find yourself actually upgrading a habit or resolving a problem, like, and in this case, in my experience, your more meaningful relationships are very good places. If you notice that by virtue of pointing your attention to something where you've got an avoidance behavior, and by pointing your attention at that in like a meditation practice, you can become more and more nuanced towards it. You can then, if you find that by doing that in a relationship with your spouse, for example, when something comes up that you would have previously unconsciously avoided, you don't avoid it. And as a result, something let's call it meaningful happens. So it may not necessarily be happy immediately, but it shifts something in the relationship, so the relationship is stronger, it's richer, it's more nuanced. Then what you can do is you can actually loop that. And this, by the way, is neurohacking, by the way. You can loop that in a meditation practice or any other practice with a gratitude practice. So the next time that you're focusing on this particular avoidance, you can then give yourself the win. You can okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm really going to focus on that fact that I really do believe that I did something that increased the meaningfulness of this most meaningful relationship, and actually
allow
really
myself to feel good about it. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you for doing such a good job. Thank you for working so hard on getting better at being able to be in relationships that matter. And that's great, right? So now you're actually giving that reward in deeply, like it's a deep reward. It's not an extrinsic override. It's actually a deep reward. Yeah. And so you're training yourself to have better habits at converting avoidance into noticing, and converting noticing into curiosity. And that's a big piece. That's a lot of work. That's not trivial. And so but it's core scaffolding, because once you've got that core scaffolding in place, you'll be able to find yourself when something comes up, it feels quite wrong. instead of shutting it down or avoiding it, which are the two sort of habitual responses, you actually find yourself in a state of real
As a learning
curiosity.
opportunity. Yeah, yeah,
You're
yeah.
like, huh, okay, what just happened here? That's interesting.
Yeah.
And curiosity is not necessarily, or not at all, foolishness. You could be aware of a wrongness, and you may choose to actually avoid it. Like, no, that actually is, in fact, wrong. That's a bad, what's happening right here is not a good thing. Let me skillfully, this is discernment, right? Discernment has this characteristic of choosing what you relate with and how you relate with it. Like, once you can perceive it clearly, perceive what is real clearly, then you're empowered to actually choose effectively how you want to be in relationship with it. So discernment kind of includes a little bit of both, more from my mind on the perception side, but frankly, I may just be early in the process of getting it from the choosing side. But until you have clarity of perception, your ability to separate, let's just use, again, simple, taste. So I take something, I don't know what it is, and I bite it, and it tastes terrible. I can choose not to eat it anymore. Right? I'm using a really nice, high quality perception and using that to inform better choices. I could choose my relationality more effectively.
So conscious avoidance in full knowledge of what you're doing is not the avoidance that we're talking about. Yeah.
Exactly. And so then, and we only have just a few minutes, but just enough, I think. And so then the last little piece here is the very cognitive, right? So now we're like in the place of the mental. And here's where we have, when we talked about shutting down, which we didn't talk about a lot, but shutting down and avoidance. So two things that are get in the way: projection, lack of presence. And here, what I want to do is I want to talk about the deeply cognitive, and perhaps quite specifically prefrontal cortex and Broca's area, like the linguistic stuff, where you import an entire schema of what is into a perception. So I perceive, and here's lots. I perceive you. You have a shape to your face. You have a color to your skin. You have a tone to your voice. You have a context that's behind you. And of course, I cannot help but be making a very large number of assumptions, expanding that to provide more and more context for me to have a sense of what relationality is. But those assumptions are assumptions, right? There's what I am perceiving. So for example, here's a very simple one. I don't actually know for sure that there's a back to your head.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I have a very nice high quality heuristic that there probably is. And I will assume under almost all circumstances there is, but I don't know for sure. In fact, to be perfectly frank, I don't even know for sure you're a real human. Mm-hmm. You may be an amazingly effective AI deepfake.
Yeah.
So there's a noticing of what actually is really what I'm perceiving, and then an ability to notice what am I projecting onto that perceiving to create context to support my capacity to make choices at all. Mm-hmm. And know and be, wow, that's a lot. There's a whole lot that I'm projecting onto that context, and that's okay because I can't do crap unless I can do that. But then to just be aware of that distinction, and even to have a certain in my mind, almost like a topography, a topographical map of what's really, really dense at the center. Like the notion that you have a three-dimensional body is the kind of heuristic that I'm willing to make. I'll plant a stake on that and I can build on that. But the notion that you have malevolent intent because you have an English accent, and that reminds me of bad guys in movies, probably not the best thing to import as a heuristic, right? And there's a lot of that. And so then you have a whole bunch of loops, loops and loops and loops, where there's a combination of the possibility that I may be importing things into what is here that are in fact not really here. I'm just importing them. And then I could be reacting to my own importing with a variety of different physiological responses. And if I'm not noticing my own physiological response, like I may, for example, you may say something, some phrase, and that phrase may mean something to you. It may mean something different to me because of our quite different context. So I'm importing a huge schema of what that means. And it may mean something to me which is quite hostile. And so now I find that my body is responding with a kind of a contraction and an arousal. Like I'm getting ready to fight and I'm moving
So
away from.
what's the antidote to this then? Is it when you notice that coming up in yourself, you clarify with your interlocutor whatever it is that may be troubling, and what's the remedy to this?
Yeah, well then remember that those habits. So one habit is a habit of pace, slow down. Another habit is a habit of awareness. Listen closely. Listen to the nuance. The body can be quite nuanced. So even if you've got one portion of your body is retracting, other portions of your body might not be. Remember eyes and hands and ears to get a better sense of what is real. If a small part of me is actually recoiling from what happened, but the remainder of me isn't, then I'm like, okay, that's interesting. That tells me a lot about what I'm perceiving. Let me slow down more. The ability to distinguish between what is real, what is really perceived, what is really happening, and what is important, which may involve more slowing down.
Yeah, I was going to say that
And
that strikes me as being an extremely difficult thing to do with any degree of assuredness or accuracy, because as you said right at the start of your point, we import a whole bunch of stuff, and as we get to know the person better, we discard some of the stuff that we initially imported and we replace it with stuff which we have actually learned
right,
about them, right? But I think it's very, I mean, maybe I'm just not particularly self-aware, but I think that would be extremely difficult to know with any certainty where the boundary between what you actually know about a person and what you've imported about them it really is.
I spend a lot of time with my wife, and we've been together for a while. We've been through a lot of stuff.
Mm.
I'm still continuously surprised by the degree to which I don't really know who she is. So that's that.
Yeah.
Yet at the same time, the body and experience has a lot of wisdom to it. And fortunately, going back to this notion of evolution, humans are naturally band organisms. And we naturally show up in groups.
Mm-hmm.
And that evolved over a very long period of time. Right? The notion of social animal is very old. And on the basis of social animal, you built more and more and more construct. And so this instrument is actually remarkably effective at knowing what's really happening. Have you ever done something called a family constellation?
No.
Yeah, it's a really neat practice where you could get a group of strangers together. And let's say you spend 3 days together in some activity. It could be anything. You could be camping in the woods. You could be in some kind of workshop. Doesn't really matter. And then what you can do is you can actually ask one of them to be the center of a family constellation. So think like solar system. This person's playing the role of the sun.
Mm-hmm.
And their job is, without using any words, just by physically grabbing people and moving them, to orient people in space and in orientation around them at the center. So you might stand in the center and kind of feel, and then kind of grab me and move me here and turn me, and then go back to the center and feel, and then grab this person and move them a little bit. And like very coarse, like it's literally just spatial orientation, distance and left, right, rotation, sometimes up, down, by the way, sometimes even with a little bit of motion. And then what can happen is, so you go through that whole process, it's all silent. And then you go through and you ask each person in order what their perception of what was happening was. The first thing you'll notice is that it's shockingly accurate. But by the way, not necessarily a third person. So if you moved Bob somewhere, you and Bob will quite likely have a very similar sense of what was happening there. I may not have any idea. I may be quite wrong in what I thought was happening between you and Bob.
Right.
And also, so the next is you could say, okay, now everybody shift to where you think is more rightness. Remember, using those feeling systems. Where's a more rightness? And what I noticed, at least in doing this, is that on the one hand, everybody shifts. And on the other hand, everybody shifts just a little bit. And then finally, and it actually does feel better. So everybody has the capacity to notice what is the right actual orientation, the right relationship. This is because we're running social mammal machinery, which is really old, really robust, honed over millions of years, and it's really good at knowing that. And it's knowing what's the right orientation. And by the way, it's been watching for 3 days in this hypothesis and tracking all the stuff deeply, 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 deeply. So yes, the degree to which you can run in conscious awareness in this tiny, tiny little window of attention that we focus, that we can actually call conscious attention, the degree to which you can run this kind of discernment there is minuscule. But the degree that you can run it on top of this whole scaffolding, remarkably nuanced.
Okay. So how do we get out of our own way and allow that to happen then? I guess that's the key, isn't it?
That's the key. Yeah. And that's practice. practice and practice both in yourself and just learning how to move yourself into dispositions of curiosity, practice learning how to have real right relationship with your own feeling systems and practice that. Even, again, physicality, practice learning how to taste tastes and smell smells and distinguish sounds, like just tuning the basic raw components. Practice putting yourself in circumstances where you're really afraid and where you're really excited, and you can feel how that creates a different sort of set of ripples in your interior. And then in life, just notice where your discernment seems to have shown up accurately. It's given you good, precise, subtle perspective on what's happening, and notice where it hasn't. And just recognize that you're going to be a lot wrong, and you might be a little more right. And as you do it more and more, you can be more and more confident, but never fully.
Got to be wide awake and super aware all the time, haven't you? All the time, wide awake and super aware. It's not easy. It's not easy.
No, but it does become less effortful.
Right, yeah.
Yes, go back to our skateboarder. Like, a kickflip's a seriously hard thing to do, but once you've done it enough, your body has it and it takes care of that. Or to be more common, riding a bike. When you're 6, 5, 4, when you're first riding a bike, that's really hard and scary, and you could crash. But once you've actually practiced it enough, this system can actually integrate it, and render it into the autonomic that makes it now a baseline upon which you can do other skills.
So good discernment can become autonomic, you'll say. In fact, you want it to be, don't you? That's the whole point. You want to get your reason out the way. You want it to be. That's the whole point. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And then you can allow reason to be on top of something, that it's a solid foundation. The ability to say, okay, now maybe I'm actually dealing with different cognitive biases. Let me be thoughtful about them, kind of run some questions, and how can I triangulate? So there's, again, a sort of a right relationship. If you get the participatory knowing solid and really clear and clean and well functioning, then the propositional knowing actually can do its work well. Not perfectly, because, all kinds of things going on, but well. All right, man. Unfortunately, this is the end time I had for this conversation.
No problem.
We can schedule another one.
If you're amenable to having another one, I'd really like to, because
yeah, I'd look forward to another call.
Great, nice one. Thanks very much, Jordan. Appreciate it. Take it easy.